Good evening, everybody, and welcome to webinar number 61, Anti-Racist Practice, Widening the Debate. So tonight, we've got lots of special guests for you. I'm just going to chat to you for a couple of minutes, just while the room fills up. So you can see we've got to near enough 50 people, which is fantastic. So I'm just going to hand over to Siobhan because we've got just over 100 people, and then we'll get on with the webinar. And I'm going to look in the chat and be very, very jealous of everybody's tea. So I'm going to pop myself on mute, and then over to you, Siobhan.
Thanks very much, Kelly, and welcome to everybody. You may see, you'll see a lot of faces actually on screen tonight. So we have three very special guests, and they will introduce themselves as they each speak. So three very special guests. We're also joined by a couple of people who may want to become team members in the future. So over the next few weeks, you might see a few faces pop up because we're inviting people who are thinking about joining the team to come and see things from our perspective. So tonight we are going to be talking about anti-racist practice. As Kelly said, we're looking though at widening the debate tonight. Ever since we started our webinars in June last year, so 61 webinars since. In each season, we've had a real commitment to anti-racist practice. So in season 1, we did our very first webinar, even just 6 sessions in. So number 6 was about anti-racist practice, the theory and the practice. It was a panel webinar. You can watch it back on YouTube, hugely popular webinar at the time. In season 2, we looked at continuing the conversation around anti-racist practice with our a friend to the team, Prospera Tedham, who came and talked to us about her 4D2P model around anti-racist practice, which was really useful. We've also had a range of other webinars each season that link into anti-racist practice. So things like the diversity session that we had fairly recently with Vivian, and owning your own placement and strategies for overcoming the language of deficit that we did with Jennifer Simpson. So we've taken, so the pictures on the screen, we've taken what we would call a belt and braces approach of looking at anti-racism separately, but also incorporating it into everything that we do. And I think that's what we should be doing in social work education, actually taking a belt and braces approach to looking at anti-racist practice for social work. For tonight's session, we did actually want to have somebody talk to us about Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities, and we did actually have a guest lined up to talk to us about those communities. But unfortunately, the guest felt that because of what's going on with the police bill at the moment and the amount of hate that they have seen on social media, that they felt that they didn't feel that it was a safe time to actually come and talk about anti-racism and Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities. And I think that's really sad. And we wanted to acknowledge tonight that actually, we as social workers should stand in solidarity with Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities and think about what's happening. And if you read some of the literature, one of the things that I read very recently was that Gypsy, Roma, traveller communities are saying that they feel that it's basically trying to wipe out a whole community, the police bill and action on the police bill. So I'd say maybe take a little look at that. We had wanted to extend the debate into that area tonight, but we don't have somebody with the expertise to be able to do that because that person didn't feel that this was a safe time. And that's really sad, actually. So we wanted to acknowledge that. But thankfully, Rachel and June stepped in so that we could continue tonight's session, and we'll have a fuller maybe agenda for tonight in widening the debate. But talking about the hate that particular speaker discussed and that sense of hatred that was being played out within social media, and thinking about widening the debate and thinking about extending our own learning. So the picture on the front slide is trying to widen the debate, but also stretching our own learning. And if you think about that, my own learning this week has been really stretched. In a session that I was delivering earlier in the week, I was doing some training on theory and practice, and I was looking at the theory around anti-oppressive practice, and one of the people in the training session talked about the pyramid of hate, which really was new to me, and I'd not really heard of it. I think maybe vaguely, but I'd never really thought about it in any detail. And so since then, I've been looking at it. It's very much a theory from sociology. If you're not familiar with it, then I would suggest going and taking a look at the pyramid of hate, which June studied in her first degree and knew about it. But I'd never really thought about this as it related into social work. But I think it's a really interesting way of looking at how small acts of bias, like jokes and stereotyping, can actually then be the foundations of this pyramid of hatred. And I think it's very important for us to consider how each step of this is leading towards, well, what sits at the top of the pyramid is the act or intent to deliberately and systematically annihilate an entire people. And so we'll be talking about some elements of this tonight and how this might fit in. And if it's, it was a theory that I wasn't familiar with, so I thought maybe it would be a theory that you might be interested in going and exploring further. So I thought, I'll definitely put that into the introduction for tonight. But whilst I was trying to research this, because as I say, somebody raised it with me and I thought, yeah, I've heard of that, but I want to go and have a look at it a bit more. So I did. Then one of the things that I came across was a very recent addition to the literature around the pyramid of hate, which was developed in 2018 by the Anti-Defamation League. But that since then, the antidote of that has been developed as the pyramid of love. And that reminded me very much of the webinar that we did on professional love and the need for professional love. And if you remember, if you were at that webinar, we concluded it with the words of Nelson Mandela that if people can be taught to hate, then people can be taught to love, because love is the first thing, the first emotion that comes to us. And so I think I'd like to kind of balance that pyramid of hate with the potential of the pyramid of love. And what sits right at the bottom of that pyramid of love is what we absolutely need if we are going to promote learning, and that's curiosity. That whole need for professional curiosity in social work is huge. And so for me, that gives the kind of opening to tonight. I'm not going to speak anymore now because I want to hand over to our guests. We've got a really packed night. We've got 3 amazing guests who will each introduce themselves and take us on a journey to extend the debate around anti-racist practice. So we're going to start off with Rachel. So if it's okay, if I can ask you, Rachel, to unmute yourself and you take us from here.
Thanks, Siobhan. Hi everyone, I'm Rachel. I'm a social worker and a practice educator in the East Midlands, and at the moment I'm working for the NHS, so helping the NHS with safeguarding practice and sort of shaping local policy in terms of safeguarding in health services. So I wanted to talk about anti-racist social work practice in the context of white privilege and the role of white social workers, and how that role can either be to reinforce racism in social work or can be to actively work to challenge and disrupt it. And of course, we're all here because we want to do the former. So these are some of the things that I think we need to be thinking about and working towards if we want to have a hope of doing that successfully. So next slide. So I'm going to look first at the concept of white privilege. So we're starting to understand how white privilege functions in our lives. And then that's going to lead us on to why it's so important for white social workers in particular to take responsibility for being actively anti-racist. And then I'm going to talk about some things that, as a white social worker myself, I'm finding most important in my efforts to be an ally and to be anti-racist. I think it's important to come to this conversation as social workers with, of course, all of our social work knowledge and values and skills. So obviously Siobhan's just been talking about professional curiosity. You know, those things are really important. But we also need to come to it as people and be honest and vulnerable about where we're coming from. So that's what I'm going to try and do. But I'm also going to try and be fairly quick because I want to leave space, as much space as I can for Vicky and June. So I'm not going to try and take up all your time. So next slide. So in order to really understand and act as allies, I think we first need to understand how we benefit from white privilege. So white privilege is benefits, it's a series of benefits and advantages that white people have because they're white. And it's unearned, of course. We're born white. We don't do anything to gain access to these benefits and these privileges that we have. We just have them. The reason that we have them is because we live in a society where the systems and institutions that we sort of function in were created by other people with white privilege by design to maintain that sort of status quo and to maintain that balance of power and essentially to uphold white supremacy. That's what the society we kind of live and function in was designed for. And that those racial disparities at that structural level also influence our culture. So they influence the cultural racism that Black and minority ethnic people face every day. And they also influence the racism that they experience on an individual level as well. We as white people don't have to worry about having these experiences. And that's the essential concept of white privilege. But to sort of give that a bit more context in our own lives, I think sometimes, as embarrassing as it is, can be difficult for white people to articulate. Can be difficult to articulate how exactly it shows up in our everyday lives. So white privilege, it can so easily be taken for granted and not noticed if you're not observing the racism that is a daily experience for people from Black and minority ethnic groups. You're not sort of seeking out and listening to the voices of people who are having those experiences. You could well struggle to identify it in your own life. And even as someone who's conscious of the concept, there are still things that I'm ignorant to. So I remember just a few weeks ago, me and June were having a conversation and she was talking about, just for as an example, how much money Black women have to spend on hair care. And I think as a white person, these moments you have where you learn about an experience like that because you've never had to deal with it yourself, that is white privilege. Another concept that I really like in sort of thinking about how white privilege works is Robin DiAngelo, who is a white author and speaks a lot about white privilege and white fragility. She talks about the concept of almost being able to move through life raceless. So not having to be at all conscious that you have race or that you are of a certain race, because you never have to think or plan ahead. How is this situation going to play out for me? How are people going to receive me because of my race? How is my access to this service going to work? Am I going to face an obstacle here because of my race? We just don't have to factor that into our decision making as white people. And so it's almost this experience of being raceless. I quite like that concept when thinking about how white privilege actually functions in our life. For this reason, I'm going to get on towards the end of my part to talking about like the importance of reading for white social workers. But I think another thing for any white people, white social workers who are struggling to sort of get to grips with this concept of white privilege, one thing that might be a good starting point is the white privilege test. So you can put that into Google. It's, for me, the first response that comes up. There's a series of 26 questions, sort of covering different experiences that you might have going to the museum, trying to access particular services, being stopped by the police. Then it does a really good job of kind of covering racism at the structural, the cultural and the individual level. And I think as you go through that, it will really help to illustrate just how little you, or not at all, have to factor your race into those everyday situations. Really highlights that actually racism is a daily experience for people from Black and minority ethnic groups. So that's something that's interesting to look at as well, in sort of helping to illustrate the idea. So we've talked about these privileges and this concept of being able to move through life raceless and not have to worry about these things. The Black and people from Black and minority ethnic groups, so in the context of the families we support, but also the social workers that we work alongside, they don't have that privilege. The examples of racial disparities for people from Black and minority ethnic groups, in both of those contexts, so in the context of people we support and in the context of social workers, are numerous. And I think that's something that June is touching on a little bit later, but there are many, many, many examples of those racial disparities. You know, I will never have to worry that when I challenge a partner agency that I'm working with in relation to how they're supporting a child, that I will be labelled as combative or aggressive or anything like that. If I'm ever stopped by the police, I can be sure that that's not because of my race. And I'll never have to worry that in a professional meeting, a professional might stumble over trying to pronounce my name and then make a joke out of it, or screw up their face in apprehension of having to try to pronounce my name, and essentially ridiculing a central part of who I am, my name. That's never going to happen to me. So next slide. Once we understand our privilege, the important thing is what we do. So anti-racism is about actively working to dismantle these systems and to challenge and disrupt racism. We can't claim to be anti-racist if we're not willing to act when we notice these things happening, because silence is oppressive. Silence is what helps these racist systems and the disparities continue. So we have to act. Why is it so important for white social workers to act in particular? So on to the next slide now. Several reasons. So it's not the job of people from Black and minority ethnic groups to create this change, because they didn't create the systems that are causing this oppression. As we said earlier on, these systems were created by people with white privilege, and they were designed to keep things that way. So it's really for us as white people and white social workers to challenge and to disrupt it. Our white privilege also protects us from a lot of the race-based assumptions and consequences that can come along with challenging professionals, challenging certain systems. And the people who are affected by racism don't have that level of protection. So it's important that we use it. I know with the last session, Prospera was talking about the guide to allyship and how we need to, in order to be an ally, we need to be transferring our privilege to people who don't have that privilege. And so that's kind of the idea here, is that we need to be using our privilege to dismantle it, essentially. And finally, social work and social work values are all about social justice. And if we're not using our position and our skills and our knowledge to challenge when that's not happening, and to act out those values in ourselves and demand them from other people, then what is the point, and what are we doing here? So this is what social work is supposed to be. So this is why it's so important. All too often, conversations about anti-racism, Black Lives Matter, and our role as white people to redress this get derailed by these sort of statements. And I'm sure that you've all heard these and seen them before. but these are some of the things that can come up. I think these come from a mixture of ignorance about white privilege and the way that it functions, and also a sense of defensiveness from white people and a fear of being labelled as racist, because if you're labelled a racist, you're therefore labelled a bad person, and people do not want to be that. So things like "I don't see colour" can come up a lot, which is meaningless and patently not true. But also, if you don't see someone's colour, you don't see the oppression that they're facing and the racism that they're facing. And so that's not helpful. I'm not racist, though. Again, we're going to talk about concepts of white fragility, but this is really kind of that played out in conversation, isn't it? This fear that I can't be racist, because that would make me a bad person. But also, again, I think it's an ignorance around how racism functions. Just because you're not sort of actively perpetrating overt racism towards someone on an individual level, that doesn't mean you're not helping to kind of uphold the systems that are perpetuating racism. And finally, fear. So I'm scared I'll upset someone. I don't want to get in trouble. Ultimately, as we were saying before, we as white social workers have privileges that do protect us and shield us from that to quite an extent. And so we need to be using that. But also, to a certain extent, tough. I'm going to talk in a minute about one of the key things being decentering ourselves. It's not about us as white social workers. It's not about our feelings or what's in our best interests. So, this change isn't going to happen by itself. We probably are going to have to upset someone at some point. Obviously, we try and challenge in the most professional way that we can. And we use our sort of social work skills and we do things respectfully. But then there may be times where we have to cause an issue and we have to rock the boat a bit. So what do we do once we've kind of got to the point where we're understanding the concepts a bit more? What can white social workers actually do? So I think the biggest thing for me that I think I would want to drive home, I think in terms of what has been really central for me, is educating yourself. So we need to educate ourselves on the experiences of daily racism that Black and minority ethnic groups face. Learn about experiences that aren't yours. So any way that you can do that, books, articles, podcasts, audiobooks, from people of colour, from people from different various backgrounds. We need to kind of be trying to consume as much of that as we possibly can, because like I say, we don't live these experiences. So we need to be seeking out these stories and in order to really understand them for ourselves. And again, use your social work skills of professional curiosity. We can't be afraid to have these difficult conversations with the families that we're working with and to ask the difficult questions. So with families that we're working with, when we're completing assessments, it's asking these families what is important to them in terms of their identity. How do they find that racism shows up in their everyday life? Ask them what that looks like to them and what that feels like to them. These are conversations we really need to be having, or we're not going to get to grips with it. So in terms of some recommendations, things that I found really helpful, Natives by Akala is really great in terms of, it's a bit of a biographical spin, but he also delves quite deep into the history behind some of his own experiences growing up as a Black man in Britain. Very much would recommend that. Our very own June has a really great book, Can We All Be Feminists? This is really excellent if you want to learn more about intersectionality. So there's 17 essays in here from various writers from all different experiences. 10 out of 10 would recommend, available on Amazon. So try and consume as much of that sort of content as you possibly can. That's going to put you in the best position, I think, to be able to practice in an anti-racist way. Next, decenter yourself. So like I said earlier on, this isn't about our feelings, our interests, and what's best for us. We're kind of past that point. We need to be actively doing things that maybe make us feel uncomfortable. You know, we're living in a system where we benefit from racism, essentially. And so we should feel uncomfortable. That is really wrong. We should feel uncomfortable, and we are going to have to do things that are not easy and that are really difficult and tense and uncomfortable for us. You know, it's not easy to challenge your manager or another professional, but it's what's necessary sometimes. So some examples about sort of decentering yourself and being able to kind of understand the concepts of white privilege a bit better that I was talking about. 2 books I'd very much recommend are Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Rennie Edo-Lodge and White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. They're really great on those concepts. And then obviously, finally, we need to do something, we need to take action. So we need to challenge institutions and individuals when we identify racism at any level. So whether that's overt racism, whether that's racial disparities and structural racism, or microaggressive behaviours, we need to call it out where we see it, and we need to do that even when it's scary or uncomfortable. I think it's not just calling it out in the moment as well, but seeking resolutions and guarantees that things are going to change in that respect and be done differently in the future. We're looking for change in the system and not just a one-off apology where nothing really actually changes. So if we feel that we're not getting that, we need to be not letting things go, and we need to be escalating issues. Obviously, we need to be doing that in a professional and respectful way, still following our social work values and all of those things, but we do need to be escalating issues where we're not seeing a resolution. And we need to be, again, not censoring ourselves in doing that. This isn't about us being good people or good social workers. We need to kind of amplify the voices of people who are experiencing racism when we do that. And I guess just final thought, this is an ongoing thing that we need to be doing. So this isn't something that we do once and then we've done our job. This is going to be an ongoing issue that we need to be thinking about. And yeah, if we need to do it every time we see it, if we stay silent, then we're helping to oppress and we're helping to uphold these systems. So that's what I have found has been important for me, but that's all.
Thank you so much for that, Rachel. That was really helpful, and I think a really useful starting point for us to think about that white privilege. So great, I think. And I completely agree with you about June's book. You know, I've got it on my shelf behind me. But then there's another book that I think could be really helpful for people, because it's specifically in educating ourselves around the experience of our colleagues of colour. Then I think Outlanders is a great book. If you've not got it, I'd advise that's another really useful book, narratives, largely hidden narratives from social workers of colour. And so thank you very much, Rachel. We're going to move straight on to our next guest, and Vicky, I'm going to leave you to introduce yourself, Vicky. So if you can put your mic on and take us through it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Siobhan. I love these webinars I've attended, and such a privilege being here. Thank you, Rachel. That was amazing. I've been noting things down to take with me, and hopefully we'll be able to learn from you. Quick introduction. So my name is Vicky Hart. I'm a social worker. Surprise. I've been qualified over 20 years. I've worked in lots of different areas of social work, but mostly adults. I've worked in adult services, older adult services, mental health services. I've practiced as an AMP, I've practiced as a best interest assessor. I worked at the CQC for a few years as an inspector, worked in forensic social work, and just a few weeks ago I moved to Social Work England. where I am now, but just want to emphasize this is absolutely, I agreed to this before I moved. This is very much a personal piece, but you'll see that I'm talking very much about my experience, and I'm talking about my experience as a Jewish woman. So I would count myself as someone who comes under that minority ethnic label, but I don't know if you can see me. I don't know if you can see the slides. I'm white. So I do benefit from white privilege, but alongside that, I have particular experiences of being part of a minority ethnic group and ticking that other box in terms of ethnicity. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what being Jewish is. I'm going to talk a little bit about anti-Semitism, because I think it's important very, very quickly to understand the context of it. And then talk about, I might skip over some of the slides just in terms of time and just talk a little bit about intergenerational trauma, because that aspect actually is not specific to one particular minority ethnic group, and I think it covers a lot. It can be extrapolated out to a lot of groups. So if we can move on to the first slide. And I think I just need to explain what is being Jewish. I sometimes take it for granted because it's the community I grew up in. I grew up in a religious Jewish community. And there are these kind of conversations about, is it a race? Is it religion? Is it an ethnicity? I'll start with the easy part. So Judaism is the religion practiced by Jewish people, but not all Jewish people practice Judaism. So it's not solely a religion. There are a lot of atheist Jews, there are a lot of secular Jews for whom the religion isn't an aspect of their life. But there is something that holds us together. I wouldn't describe us as being a race, because people can convert to Judaism. There are Jewish people, I'm white, but there are Black Jewish people, there are Jewish people from South Asia, Southeast Asia, South America, a lot of Jewish people, Middle East, indigenous in the Middle East. You know, the Jewish people can look very different. So it's not a single race. In terms of ethnicity, I think, well, I mean, if we slip through if you look at the legal definition in terms of the Equality Act, it does very much clearly come up as an ethnicity, and that's probably where it sits most equivalently with an English language. Now, you know, we have in our language, and I think this is part of the things that aren't quite understood. So in our language, in Hebrew, there's a word, Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, the nation of Israel, but it doesn't quite match with Western conceptions of race or of society. So, and I think this is one of the things, is we're having to adjust ourselves into the Western conceptions, the Western descriptions. So so that's the kind of nearest I can find. In terms of where is the Jewish community? So there are in Europe, there are just over 1 million Jewish people. Just as a comparator, in 1939 there were 9.3 million Jewish people in Europe, and as of this year, last year, 1.3 million Jewish people in Europe. Of that, in the UK, about 290,000, 0.4% of the UK population, 0.2% of the world population. It's a small community. Most of the population in the UK is in London, over half, 160,000. But some of the other areas where there are larger communities are Manchester, 25,000, Leeds, I'm doing this off the top of my head, Leeds 8,000, Birmingham I think 3,000. So the smaller community, the larger communities are actually not that big. And it's just to give you a sense of kind of the size of the community and where we are. If we can just move on to the next slide. Let's talk a little bit about anti-Semitism, and you'll see on the slide I've written anti-Semitism without a hyphen, and that is very, very intentional. And that's because anti-Semitism is a created word. It's not being anti-Semites, because Semites don't exist as a people. It's actually a word taken from the linguistic group, from Semitic languages, but it's not actually a group of people. And the word anti-Semitism was invented by a German in the 19th century who hated Jewish people. He didn't want to describe, he wanted a word to describe hating the people who were Jewish, not the religion, because that's why it's not anti-Jewish, that's why it's not Judeophobia. He wanted to create a word specifically about people whom he saw to be of an inferior race. And that's where anti-Semitism comes from. So we're using the language continually of people that hate us, and that removing the hyphen is kind of an intentional point to make, that this is a created word. Anti-Semitism has existed as long as Jewish people have existed, going back thousands of years, and there are different manifestations. The blood libels, I'm rushing through this quite quickly, but blood libels, date back medieval times when, kind of purges were started by accusations of Jewish people killing Christian children. You actually see in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, this is one of the tales, is about a blood libel, and these led to then massacres and Jews being slaughtered all over the place, being expelled from different countries. But other manifestations would have been, again, spreading the plague, Jews being accused of spreading the plague. And some more recent manifestations have been 9/11, might have seen Jews being accused of causing 9/11, of coronavirus. So there is a modern manifestation of blood libels. The racial libels very much led to the kind of Nazi mentality of, Jewish people as an inferior race. The blood must be destroyed. Didn't matter what you believed, didn't matter what your religion was. This group of people must be annihilated to make the world a better place. And you'll see some of those stereotypes of Jewish people, the long noses, the swarthy Eastern European kind of look. That does manifest itself in some of the British culture, the Fagin, the Shylock type, look sometimes. Probably the most common I've come across, certainly in social work fields, is the economic libels, the Jews having power, the Jews controlling banks. Of course, that comes from the medieval times, again, where the only professions that Jewish people were allowed was as money lenders. But it's transformed now, and you can hear these kind of theories about these Jewish power. And I've put conspiracies in the middle because there's always an element, I think, of anti-Semitism. It spreads into a lot of different conspiracy theories. So I've kind of gobbled that up really quickly, but it was just to give a kind of perception of some of the differing types of attitudes that aren't always picked up as being racism in terms of Jewish people. If we can move on again, I'm not going to dwell on this because you can read it, you can read the Equality Act, but just that last sentence about the British courts actually defining that Irish travellers, Jews, Romani Gypsies and Sikhs are specific ethnic groups. Probably shouldn't go here, but I will. In terms of the Labour Party last year were found guilty of racism against Jewish people, discrimination on the basis of race as well as religion. So there is that legal protection there, just something to be mindful of. If we can we move on now? I'm trying to shoot through, but this was a little bit, I just wanted to talk about some of my personal experiences of being other. And it means I grew up, as I say, I grew up in a family that was quite religious. My name, you see my name, Victoria Hart, it sounds very English. And as Rachel said, I wouldn't suffer, that's a part of my white privilege. But Victoria was a name specifically chosen by my family to fit in. I have a Hebrew name as well, which I wouldn't use, but apart from kind of in particular contexts. But that's the name I'd be buried with, for example. But it's a name chosen to fit in because of fear. My surname was changed by my great-grandparents to sound English so that we fit in all the time. And talking about names being important, I think, it's this aspect of a part of your identity always having to hide. And that's what my grandparents would always tell us, you need to always know who will hide you, which of your neighbours would hide you and which would shop you, always have your passport ready and always know where your passport is, always have a bag packed in the hall. And you grow up with this. I grew up around people that had the tattoos on their arms, that wouldn't talk about where their families came from. And I'll talk a little bit about the intergenerational trauma with that. But you grow up with this. And so while I look and sound white British, I really don't feel white British. I feel very much aside from that. I don't do anything, you know, I don't celebrate Christmas. That's a really stupid example perhaps, but you've got this sense, and we were always told that the French Jews, the German Jews, the Dutch Jews were the most assimilated, and yet their neighbours turned on them. In Jersey, in the Channel Islands, all those Jews in the Channel Islands were shipped out to the death camps. So, you know, it's growing up with that sense that you can never quite settle anywhere, because that's been the experience of my grandparents, my great-grandparents, my great-great-grandparents going back. If we can we move on? I'm going to try and kind of finish up a little bit by talking about intergenerational trauma. And you'd hear some of that coming out through what I'm talking. In terms of keeping this is research done particularly around Holocaust survivors and their children and the impact. But I think it does have resonance with a lot of minority ethnic groups and other minority groups, actually. This sense of keeping family history hidden. So I didn't find out while my grandparents were alive. They would never talk about their families. And I actually only found out relatively recently that I have a whole branch of the family that just ends Sobibor 1943. Look, their siblings, their cousins, and I just didn't know about that. We were never told. And a part of that is moving on to that shame of the living. 2/3 of the Jewish people in Europe were killed. So however distant you were, you knew that you were lucky. And there's enormous shame in surviving almost. This silence of friends and collusion of neighbours. I talked about that most recently. Just when I was talking to the previous slide about, these were the people that you lived amongst. And of course, there were some fantastic people, don't get me wrong, fantastic, very brave people. But knowing that that was what could happen around you. And in terms of that impact, and I think this is just the key point, is that hypervigilance. I definitely feel that hypervigilance. Sometimes I can be oversensitive. But there's also this avoidance. There are a lot of people who leave the community and completely blend in because you just want to get away from it. You do not want your children to be subject to what you were subject to. And the guilt, constantly the guilt, the survivor's guilt. And so I'm just going to finish. I think if I've got, just move on. Oh, social work. What was I going to say about social work? There's one point I want to leave you with, and just to have a think about, is that I'm in a reasonably senior position now. I'm confident to talk about my being Jewish. I didn't for about 15 years of my social work career. I would never have mentioned to people I was Jewish. And if I had a social worker come to my house today, I don't think I would tell them I was Jewish. If I was in a hospital, I don't think I would tell the hospital staff that I was Jewish, because it still scares me. In this power relationship, it's okay. In that power relationship, I don't think I would. And so I'm just going to leave it there, except my last slide, which is a little bit of a plug of this anti-racist social worker book. If you've seen it, I've written a chapter in that about anti-Semitism, but there are much better chapters about that from colleagues about all aspects of anti-racist. So I'm a bit of a rush. Hope it was helpful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Vicky. And what I'd say is as well, we're very much hoping, aren't we, that you'll come back and do a session around Holocaust Memorial next year and look at that sort of anti-Semitism in more detail for us as social workers, because I think there's such a lot here that we can learn about that intergenerational trauma and so on. So thank you very much for sharing with us there. That was great. Thank you. And so we're going to go to our final guest of this evening. You've already heard about June's book. You've already seen June's book. And I'm going to ask now if June, if you could put your mic on and invite you to speak now.
Hi everyone. Thanks, Siobhan. I'm just going to ask you, Siobhan, how many minutes I have, just because I am a talker and I do not want to run over.
Well, let's say you've got 20 minutes, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what we'd agreed. So I think 20
yeah,
minutes.
That's awesome.
I
Hi,
tell you what
everyone.
we'll do, June. You just talk until you're happy, and then at some point I'll come in and I'll go, thanks, June, and then
I will have a timer because I am a talker, but I will try and get through as much of this as I can. So hi, I'm June. I am not American. I just want to preface that. I grew up in the UK, but then I went to America to do my undergraduate degree at Duke University, which is a pretty well-established institution in the US. I studied gender, sexuality, and feminist studies, and I picked up an American accent on the way back. And now proceed to confuse everybody when I tell them I'm from London. They think I'm lying. So a little bit about me. As everyone has said, I am the editor of Can We All Be Feminists? That was a book project that I did. It was published by Virago. I didn't put my timer on. Oops. Okay. It was published by Virago in the UK and Penguin Random House, Penguin Books in the US. A lot of my background has been around in feminist campaigning efforts. So one of the big things I'm known for is that I took the government to basically, when they said they were going to take feminism and remove women from the politics syllabus. I was a teenager then, and I did that campaign and had that reinstated. I've done lots of work around eradicating female genital mutilation and also child early and forced marriage. And I've spoken at most places, from classrooms and festivals in the UK and all the way to the UN. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking to you about racism, anti-racism. I'm going to specifically be focusing on the experiences of Black people within a UK context and giving you hopefully some food for thought. So one of the first things that I wanted to kind of touch on is that I think in the UK, we're really uncomfortable when it comes to talking about race, right? As someone who has been in America, I know all too well how we in the UK like to point fingers and say, well, we're not America. We don't gun people down. We don't kill Black people, which is actually a lie, right? Because there have been Black people in the UK who have been killed by police officers. And it's one of those things that I always say, it's like, okay, you're not shooting me as a Black person, but there are many ways to skin a cat, right? Am I not dying because I'm not being shot by the police? And obviously there are major cases. Stephen Lawrence comes to mind. We're thinking about Sheku Bayou, or even thinking about the fact that since 1990, there have been 500 deaths in custody of people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds in the UK. And no one has been arrested, or there's been no justice for that, right? I want to talk a little bit about England, the UK, and slavery. And I think it's important because, again, we do that thing of distancing ourselves from racism in this country. We're really, really, really good at that, right? But I'm going to kind of touch on a lot of things. So we like to do this thing where, like, well, we're not like America, right? We didn't have enslaved people in England, right? That's like a misconception. And I'm using enslaved as a specific term and not slaves, because I don't believe Black people were slaves as like a way to describe them. I believe they were enslaved into slavery. So they were sold into an institution that completely took away their rights, right? So that's a very particular choice that you'll see a lot of Black critical race theorists and Black feminists specifically using that term. But let's talk about the fact that Liverpool was one of the biggest slave ports in the UK and in Europe in generally. Let's talk about the fact that there are streets in Liverpool that are named after slave owners, right? Sir Thomas Street in Liverpool is named after Thomas Johnson, who was a slave owner. Let's talk about Edward Colston in Bristol, and the fact that as a city, there are schools and fountains and parks and streets named after a guy who had 84,000 slaves during the kind of travel from the UK to Africa and the Caribbean, and about 19,000 of them died. You know, Great Passage, if you've done your history, you know what that's like. The migration of Black people through the slave triangle. A really, really interesting documentary that a lot of you might want to see is Salt by Selena Thompson. She is, I've told Siobhan about this, she's one of my favorites. She actually is a Black woman, she's a Black performance artist, and she actually traced the slave triangle. So she went from here to Ghana to America and to Jamaica, and she went on a slave ship. And it's really interesting to kind of consider the ways in which we are linked to that history, and to start doing the work to undo this idea that we don't have to think about racism here because it doesn't really affect us. And as long as we're not gunning people down in the streets, right, then it's fine. And I can tell you, as a Black woman who has lived in North Carolina in the US and has lived in London, I do not approach police officers because I don't like them, okay? There is a history of them brutalizing Black people, my ancestors. In fact, police as an institution are tied to slave catchers. That's where police came from. They were people who were designed to catch enslaved people who escaped from plantations. That's the history of police. That's the function of that. And so I like to say, lots of people will say, well, this institution is broken or it's damaged. And then I actually say, no, it's designed and it's working just as it was designed. So I will say that social work in England is institutionally racist. And I would say more of you probably think you're anti-racist, but the vast majority of you are not. And the reason is because you live in a society that is built on the foundations of white supremacy, built on the foundations of racism, and there is not that much work being done by us individually, collectively, to actually undo those views, right? And so when you think about social work as an institution, and lots of people will say, well, you know, social workers, we're here for social justice, and we're interested, and I'm not putting that down, we're interested in anti-discriminatory, everyone starts throwing around these terms, anti-discriminatory practice, anti-oppressive practice, anti-racist practice. And I'm sitting there and thinking, okay. Social workers actually supported the eugenics movement. There are history of that. During World War II, social workers were at Japanese internment camps, putting away Japanese citizens into internment camps. Social workers in the US who were suffragists fought for Black people not to have the right to vote. Social workers, progressive era social workers, engaged in segregation in housing, in settlement housing for people who needed it, okay? That is a foundation that you're sitting on, whether it's looking at Germany or in the US, social work as a model, that is what we're sitting on as a foundation, right? And so there has to be space to acknowledge the varying ways. I mean, a really good example of this is in the US, and I talk a lot about the Indian Child Welfare Act. That act was put into place because children from native families, so indigenous tribes, and if you know a little about US history, you know about kind of the wiping and the bloodshed of the indigenous communities. But that was an act brought into, by Congress because your fellow social workers in the US were essentially removing native and indigenous children from their families and placing them with white families when they were, to the point that an act, like an actual piece of legislation had to come into effect that says, okay, if we have a child that is in foster care, what we're going to do is say before they go out to another family or white family, that we're going to go back to native tribes and actually see if tribes can take those children in so that they're not detached from their upbringing, right? And so that's an example of a government trying to basically correct the innate racism, institutional racism within social work. And those are your peers around the world, right? It's a global profession. Bringing it a little bit back to the UK, I always say, like, again, the UK system of social work here is institutionally racist, right? I think about my social work program, and I think about all the things that everyone is saying about, oh, we're super diverse and we're anti-oppressive in practice. And I look and I see, but you have only one Black woman on your staff, right? And then I think about the fact that there are only 40 Black, full professors in the UK who are Black women. And then I think about the fact that 1% of Black lecturers and professors in the UK are Black, right? 1%. So this is a program that is saying that we're anti-racist. But in actuality, are you, right? And that's not to dig at that program. I didn't say which one it was, but in general, when I look at social work in the UK and you look at the people who are the people who have power within your department, how many of your lecturers are Black? How many of your lecturers are people of color? That's what happens when I move into a space as a Black woman, right? Because I'm always a Black woman first and foremost. There's no separation of that identity. That's something that's always going to be there. And I'm always going to notice the absence of people who look like me in that space. And that's one of the benefits of white privilege, is that you walk into a space and you're always represented. And you never have to imagine where are the people who look like me, right? Social Work England has only 2.7% of its workforce being Black, right? About 10% are from BAME communities. That's really disappointing. That's your regulator, right? What does that tell you about how much they value diversity? I think a lot of times we have these platitudes after George Floyd was killed. Every single social work department in the UK, in the US, and Canada, everywhere came out with their big statement about we condone XYZ and we stand against XYZ. Businesses did it, you know, corporations were engaging in it. It's Black History Month and you all put your little, you know, logos and all the rest of it, and it's performative. It's performative because when you look at who has power within your organizations, when you look at who's actually represented in senior leadership and management on the boards and the trustees, they're not there. So it's this performative act that we often are engaging in to make ourselves feel like we're not racist, when in actuality, we're not really doing things to be anti-racist in our approach, right? When we think about social work in England, and when I talk about institutional racism within social work in England, I'm talking about the fact that we don't see directors and managers and at you know, director level in children's services and adult services. I'm talking about the fact that Black students are more likely to be failed during their assessed and supported year in employment, the ASYE, which I'm sure many of you are on. We're talking about the fact that there is an overrepresentation of Black people as agency staff. What does that mean about them not being able to secure perhaps permanent employment contracts? We're talking about the fact that Black social workers are overrepresented in fitness to practice conversations and discussions, right? And we think about how that is detrimental to their career. So there's a lot to think about. There's a lot to also think about the fact that we have Black children are overrepresented in our care system, that they're not getting adopted at the same rate. We have the overrepresentation of Black people who are actually sectioned. So that's people, I'm sure you've all learned about, oh God, here we go, I meant to know this. The Mental Health Act and mental capacity. And thinking about the high rates of Black people who are actually sectioned, what does that say about our system, right? The like early failures in place, that's the, why is there no representation there? So and you know, there's also just a lack of data, just generally about the experiences of Black people within social work in England. And I have no idea where I heard this, but it's someone said it at some panel in some discussion I went to years and years and years ago, and it's always stayed with me. And that is, what we don't care about, we don't count, right? What we don't care about, we don't count. We don't research, we don't collect data around because we don't care, right? And so we also talk about the glass ceiling of racism in terms of career progression for social workers who come from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds. Why are they struggling to go into those more senior management type roles? We talk about the fact that in this pandemic, there were reports of across the country of Black social workers being asked to do home visits to people who were had tested positive for COVID-19 and didn't have you know, PPE, subsequent PPE, and their white managers hogged PPE in their offices and joked about it and engaged in racist banter. That's your profession, right? That's our profession. That's what we're living in. So we need to be able to start having these really, really hard conversations about where this failure is. Even if you look at your PCFs and your training standards by Social Work England, there's a lot of mention about, you know, not being discriminatory and equality, but there's no real focus on really understanding or being committed towards anti-racism, right? It's not necessarily spelled out so clearly. And just, there have been lots of Black social workers who've come out and talked about their experiences. Notably, I was reading about Zoe Thomas, who has talked specifically about racial abuse on the job by clients calling her the N-word and, calling her a Black, just all kinds of derogatory terms. I'm not going to repeat them. And there's just this like collective silence, right? Like, no one's saying anything. That's why I think Outlanders will be really interesting for a lot of you to read, to actually hear the narratives of people who engage in this on a day-to-day basis, and have to deal with that and don't necessarily have support from their managers or their teams. So Britain as a country has benefited financially, culturally, artistically, legally, everywhere in this country is literally the blood, sweat, and tears of enslaved Black people, enslaved Africans, enslaved people from the Caribbean. We think about Windrush, right? And we think about, even thinking about Grenfell and how little has changed since that happened. And how we all just move on. And just thinking about how Black people in Britain continue to be, suffer from lower incomes, health disparities, housing issues around stable housing, stable jobs. That is a function of a racist society. And then we think about how we as social workers then go in, right? I always say to people, being poor doesn't make you a bad parent. At least that's what I think. Being poor doesn't make you a bad parent. But then there's institutional racism that means that a lot of Black parents cannot provide for their children, right? They don't have access to employment or access to education, or they're facing discrimination on multiple levels. And then that affects whether or not they're able to parent their child, right? So just considering and thinking about why and how we might have that overrepresentation of Black children in our system. It's an institutional problem, right? It's an institutional issue that has to be completely broken apart. So I'm definitely for someone who's like, the way in which social services functions today has to completely be broken apart and put back and rebuilt, like the whole thing, the whole system gotta go, the whole thing. So just thinking about going forward, when you're thinking about theories, I didn't get to touch about intersectionality, but I will very quickly, and I will just say that intersectionality is a really interesting concept when we're thinking about inequality and anti-racism. But what really upsets me about intersectionality is that it had nothing to do with the way that white people, yes, I will say it, the way that white people and white feminists have just come and just bastardized intersectionality and just completely fucked the whole thing up. Sorry, excuse my language, but that's not what Kimberly William Crenshaw was talking about when she came up with that theory, right? A lot of white feminists would be like, I'm an intersectional feminist. What the hell, what does that mean? That doesn't mean anything. If you think about the underpinnings of intersectionality, which was, in 1989, this is a very, you have Kimberly Crenshaw, and she's looking at the fact that when you're looking at America and you're thinking, when we think about racism, we just think about that affecting Black men. And when we think about sexism, we just think about that affecting white women. And there was a space, right, of Black women who were intersecting and dealing with both. And that's what she was talking about when she was talking about intersectionality. It's about Black women, right? But everyone's co-opted it and taken it and run with it to the hills. But intersectionality is about Black women and the unique experiences of Black women. There are other theorists have come out and said, kind of played around with intersectionality. So Misogyny Noir, Moya Bailey, where she kind of talks about the unique experiences of Black women in terms of anti-racism and sexism. So when you're thinking about intersectionality in your work and your practice, just remember where that foundation came from. And also remember that intersectionality is not a stacking game. It's not like I'm from this, I'm from London and I'm like, intersectionality is about power and frameworks of power and how marginalized identities come together to kind of oppress people further, right? So my existence as a Black disabled woman, I'm dealing with racism, I'm dealing with sexism, and I'm dealing with ableism. And those two things intersect to make me more vulnerable. That's what we're thinking about when we talk about intersectionality. We're thinking about structures. I have 58 seconds and I have to shut up. But I guess what I will end by saying is that the work really starts with you. It's not my job to fix racism in social work, because I didn't start it. It's not my fault to fix racism as a thing, as a theory, as a practice, or however it exists, because it wasn't created by Black people. That's white people. that is your problem. And I think we have to shift the work from Black people to come up with solutions for an issue that they did not come up with, that they did not produce. So taking responsibility for your education around race and racism, taking responsibility to learn about the function of racism in Britain, the function of racism in social work, the history of racist social work practice. And there's a lot there, right? You can go look at Canada and Indigenous tribes and how social work has functioned there. You can look at the US, you can look at the UK, you can look at post-Macpherson in the UK and institutional racism, and it functions here. Do the work, right? Like, do the work of educating yourself. Stop running away when someone calls you out on being racist. If you run into me and you're racist, I'm just going to tell you to your face what you did was racist. I'm not calling you a racist person. I'm saying what you did, your action that you did was racist. Now, there are people who are just racist generally, but stop shying away from having those really difficult conversations, and do more within your communities, within your families, to actually have these conversations about race. When you're at the Christmas table, don't just think, oh, this person voted for Brexit and, I don't want to get into a fight with my grandpa, so I'm just not going to say anything. Have those conversations. Why did you make that decision? Why do you say that? Why do you think that's okay? Because white people, like you, the most times they only listen to other white people. They're not really going to listen to me as a Black woman. As hard as I can try, they're mostly going to listen to people who look like them. So do the work within your circles. It starts within your circles. I'm not asking you to go do a presentation at your university or whatever. I'm just asking you within your circle, within your group, your friend group, your family, the people who are around you, your team, the people you work with, start having those conversations about white privilege. How do I benefit in this way? Start calling out your colleagues, because it's much safer for you to call out your white colleague when they're being racist than it is for me. Because for me, I might lose my job, but you're going to have the privilege of being white, right? So just do the work, because a lot of it falls on your shoulders as people who continue to benefit from systems of white supremacy, right? And yeah, I think, and don't be scared to not know. And I think that's a big one. Like, don't be scared to not have all the right words and the right tools, but do your homework, do your reading, do the watching. There are podcasts, there are books, there are episodes, there are films. There's lots of different ways to learn, and yeah, get on with it. I'm done now, Siobhan.
Thank you so much, June. Thank you. I mean, just brilliant as ever, reading your stuff, listening to your stuff, it's just inspirational. And I think what we've done tonight, and I just thank you for stepping in, really last minute for us for doing the webinar tonight. June, there are so many things in the chat saying you'll have to come back and do your own webinar. Everybody's desperate. So, I will have to just try and be really, really nice to you and speak to you really nicely and ask you to come back at some point. So, but I think that all the speakers tonight, I think you've been amazingly just so sharp and so, really helping us to extend the debate, really helping to challenge me to extend my learning. I think it's been a great night. tonight. I think, you know, the comments in the chat have been really, I think, recognising that. So we know already that Vicky's coming back to do us a full webinar. I'm very hopeful that June might come back and do us a full webinar. And thank you so much to all three of you. I think it's been an amazing night, loads of learning, and just really good. I think, you know, doing something around extending the debate in anti-racism has been excellent. For those of you who come to our sessions regularly, you'll know that at the end we like to tell you what we've got coming up, and we know then that loads of you get the registration links from the chat. So I think the team will put the registration links in. I'm looking at Chris thinking, am I right here that the team put the links in for next week? It's Dave normally does it, you see, but he's not here, so I don't know if we'd prepared for this, but so somebody will put in to the chat now next week what we're going to do around we're doing ethics in social work next week, and then we've got a back to basics. We know the back to basics are always popular. There we'll be looking at building confidence with reflection. So what you can see on the screen now in front of you is that's all of the sessions until Christmas that you've got there on the slides. So thank you ever so much to all of our guests tonight. I think it's been an amazing night. June, I'm going to have to do a bit of editing, I think, for YouTube. I had to write myself a note at what point the language came in. I don't know, but, you know, it's great because it shows you
so sorry. I am a swearer.
There is nothing to apologize for,
you know,
June.
it's so funny. My mom was saying, like, because I have a foster mom, and she would say, oh, you came in, you never swore, and now I ruined you.
I think, June, what it showed was your passion and your commitment, but I did have to write myself a bit of a note just before we go onto YouTube so that we don't get, you know, banned from posting up our sessions onto YouTube.
I'm sorry, guys.
No, June, there is absolutely nothing to apologise for. And I think it was, you know, they say there's a time and a place, and I think what you said was the time and the place, so it was fine. Don't apologise. So thank you ever so much to everybody for attending this week, to all of our guests, and we hope that we'll see lots of you again soon and next week maybe. Thank you very much, everybody. Good night. Goodbye.